Emily Carter once sold flowers for a living. Now she is serving decades for plotting her husband's murder. Daniel Carter, the man she once vowed to love and protect, was unknowingly marked for death by the very person he trusted most. Behind their perfect marriage was a chilling secret, a calculated betrayal that turned love into a deadly lie. Emily and Daniel Carter were the kind of couple that inspired envy. Their lives unfolded like pages from a lifestyle magazine weekend. Getaways, candlelit dinners, and smiling photos posted religiously to social media. They had been high school sweethearts who stayed together through college, marriage, and the slow, steady grind of adult life. Daniel had established himself as a sought-after physical therapist with a growing list of clients, while Emily opened her own boutique, Petal and Thorn, a quaint flower shop nestled in the heart of their small North Carolina town. Together, they were the golden couple, successful, attractive, and seemingly inseparable. Their home reflected that same image of domestic perfection. A two-story colonial-style house with blue shutters and a perfectly manicured front lawn. Emily often took pride in her garden, a carefully curated mix of peonies, hydrangeas, and lavender. Daniel, between clients, could be found washing his vintage motorcycle or grilling in the backyard. Neighbors waved when they passed by, sometimes stopping to chat about the weather or compliment Emily's seasonal wreath. Behind every smile and polite conversation, though, were unspoken questions. Some of the neighbors whispered about the arguments they sometimes heard low, sharp voices cutting through otherwise peaceful nights. Still, no one wanted to believe anything was wrong. In public, Daniel always had his arm around Emily. She laughed at his jokes, brought cupcakes to community events, and attended local church gatherings alone when he worked weekends. To the world, they were a model couple. But beneath the surface, their relationship had grown strained. Emily had become withdrawn, less engaged with her customers, more prone to unexplained absence. Daniel, on the other hand, started arriving home late, citing work emergencies or client demands. The tension simmered just below the surface, visible only in the tightness of Emily's smile or the silence that settled between them at dinner. Financial troubles began to mount quietly. Despite their successful appearances, Emily's boutique was barely breaking even, and Daniel had taken on extra hours at a nearby rehab center. Credit card bills were left unpaid for months, and their savings slowly vanished. Daniel had refused Emily's suggestion to sell the house or downsize, insisting they would recover. But the growing debt added pressure neither of them wanted to admit. That pressure began to erode whatever was left of their emotional bond. Friends noticed subtle changes. Emily stopped attending her book club. Daniel skipped his regular gym sessions. When asked, they both gave rehearsed answers. Just busy with work, or we're thinking of taking a trip soon. Just need time to recharge. In reality, there was no trip being planned, and there was no time left to recharge. Emily had started looking for answers elsewhere in forums, private chat groups, even reconnecting with people from her past. Something in her had shifted, hardened. What began as disappointment and frustration soon curdled into resentment. And in that quiet, dangerous space between appearances and reality, the first seeds of a dark idea took root, an idea that would soon shatter the illusion forever. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came in the form of smoke curling into the sky above Daniel's clinic. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when a passerby noticed the haze and called emergency services. By the time firefighters arrived, flames had already damaged one of the therapy rooms and the reception area. Thankfully, no one was inside, and the fire was quickly extinguished. Investigators initially attributed it to faulty wiring in the ceiling, a conclusion Daniel reluctantly accepted. But something didn't sit right with him. He had just completed electrical maintenance a few months earlier, and the coincidence felt too sharp, too sudden. A few days later, an unmarked envelope arrived at the clinic. It contained a single sheet of paper with a typed message. "You took what wasn't yours. Now, pay the price." No return address, no fingerprints. The letter was chilling in its simplicity. Daniel, rattled and unsure, chose not to report it to police immediately. He wasn't sure if it was a prank or something more serious, but it was enough to set him on edge. He showed the note to Emily, expecting concern, maybe outrage. Instead, she brushed it off, calling it likely a disgruntled former client or a harmless prank. Her reaction struck him as oddly flat, even dismissive. But the unease only grew. Daniel began to feel watched. He'd catch glimpses of unfamiliar vehicles parked down the street from their house at odd hours. One night, while closing up the clinic, he heard footsteps behind him in the empty parking lot. When he turned around, there was no one there. Paranoia began to creep into his daily life. He installed new locks on both the clinic and their home and set up a few security cameras around the property. He started documenting anything suspiciously suspected. Voicemails, small things that previously would have gone unnoticed. Emily's response to his growing fear remained lukewarm. She told him he was overthinking, letting stress distort his judgment. She reminded him that business was slow and maybe the pressure was getting to him. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at play. He didn't want to admit it out loud, but a terrible thought had taken root. Someone was targeting him.
While Daniel obsessed over the possible threats, Emily's behavior quietly shifted. She spent more time away from home, often claiming inventory issues at her shop or late-night supply orders. Her phone was always on silent, tucked away in her purse or face down on the table. She grew more emotionally distant, offering comfort in words but not in presence. Whenever Daniel brought up his suspicions, she would quickly change the subject or reassure him with an almost rehearsed calmness. Unbeknownst to Daniel, the fire and the letter were not random. They were deliberate, part of a calculated plan already in motion. He thought he was piecing together a puzzle of outside threats, unaware that the danger was far closer than he realized. The woman he trusted the most, the one sharing his bed, his meals. His life had already crossed a line he couldn't imagine existed, and each step she took was leading him closer to a trap he would never see coming. 2 weeks after the fire, everything changed with a single arrest. A man named Ricky Salas was taken into custody during a routine traffic stop just outside town. Police found an unlicensed handgun in the glove compartment, but it was the contents of his backpack that raised immediate concern. Inside were printed photographs of Daniel Carter, maps of his clinic and home, a notepad with handwritten surveillance notes, and a burner phone. It was clear Ricky hadn't just stumbled into possession of these items, he was actively tracking Daniel. Detectives began piecing together the strange connections. Ricky had a criminal history, mostly small-time drug offenses and minor thefts, but nothing to suggest he would plan something this calculated on his own. When pressed, Ricky initially refused to talk, but after 2 days in holding and the threat of federal charges, he cracked. His story was short but explosive. He had been paid to watch Daniel, study his routine, and eventually make him disappear. The job was supposed to look like a robbery gone wrong, quick and clean. Payment, $10,000, in 2 parts half up front. The rest after the job was done. Investigators were stunned. Who would want Daniel Carter dead? The well-liked therapist had no known enemies, no ties to criminal activity. Suspicion initially turned toward business competitors or an unstable former client. But as they traced the source of Ricky's payments, a much darker picture emerged. The cash came from multiple withdrawals across various ATMs in town, all made from accounts linked to one person, Emily Carter. Authorities obtained a warrant to search Emily's phone, computer, and financial records. What they found was a carefully concealed digital trail. She had used an encrypted messaging app to communicate with Ricky under an alias, issuing instructions and sending photos. She went to great lengths to avoid detection, including using public Wi-Fi to send messages and scheduling withdrawals on days when Daniel would be out of town. But there were mistakes, small incriminating details that tied the operation back to her. A timestamp that aligned with her location. A receipt for a burner phone found in her car. Most damning of all, fingerprints on the envelope of cash recovered from Ricky's storage unit. At first, investigators kept this information close. They continued observing Emily's movements, collecting as much corroborating evidence as possible. In public, she acted like nothing was wrong. She smiled at customers, stocked flower arrangements, and attended local events with the same poised grace she was known for. But behind the scenes, the net was closing in. Her calm demeanor wasn't confidence, it was ignorance. She didn't know Ricky had been caught. She had no idea her plan was unraveling by the hour. When detectives finally brought her in for questioning, she maintained her innocence. She claimed identity theft, said someone must have cloned her cards or used her name. But with every new piece of evidence, that story became harder to believe. The woman who had once played the role of grieving wife and supportive partner now stood on the edge of exposure. What began as a whisper of suspicion had erupted into a full-blown investigation. And Emily Carter, once the symbol of small-town charm, was now the prime suspect in a cold, calculated murder-for-hire plot. The deeper investigators dug into Emily Carter's life, the more disturbing the truth became. Her carefully constructed image began to crumble under the weight of digital evidence, hidden motives, and secret communications. While Daniel believed their marriage was weathering normal struggles, Emily had been quietly planning for a future that didn't include him. Financial records revealed she had been making subtle, repeated efforts to move money from their shared savings into a separate account under a false name. Each attempt had been small enough to avoid immediate detection, but together they painted a clear picture. Emily had been preparing to stand on her own financially. Then came the inheritance. Months earlier, Daniel had received a substantial sum following the death of an uncle he hadn't spoken to in years. The $750,000 windfall was meant to give them breathing room, to pay down debts and rebuild what had been lost. But instead of offering relief, the money created distance. Daniel wanted to invest it in long-term plans, retirement, the business, even having a child. Emily, however, saw something different. A way out. Her online activity told the rest of the story. Investigators uncovered multiple deleted accounts and hidden folders on her device's encrypted message chains. Financial spreadsheets and private conversations with someone from her past. She had reconnected with a man she knew from high school, someone who had also experienced a failed marriage and was eager to start over. Their exchanges were filled with intimate remarks, late-night confessions, and, over time, vague discussions about obstacles standing in their way. Daniel's name came up more than once, never directly, but always as a barrier between them and the life they claimed they deserved. Emily's grief over her mother's recent passing had initially seemed authentic, even heartbreaking. She had taken time away from work, withdrawn from friends, and appeared emotionally fragile. But some of her behaviors during that period now raised red flags. Surveillance footage showed her meeting with Ricky Salas in a distant part of town weeks before the fire. She had gone to great lengths to keep those meetings untraceable, parking in different lots, using disguises, and paying for supplies in cash. One store receipt linked her to the purchase of the same lighter fluid found at the clinic fire. Every element of the plot had been methodical. First, the small-scale sabotage to create fear. Then, psychological manipulation to push Daniel into a state of confusion and vulnerability. Finally, the hiring of Ricky to finish the job. Emily's plan wasn't rushed or reactive. It had been unfolding over several months, each step crafted with chilling intent. She had studied how to avoid detection, learned how to use secure apps, and even scoured true crime forums to understand how others had been caught. By the time all the evidence was assembled, prosecutors had built a case that was nearly airtight. Emily Carter had gone from a grieving wife to a calculating conspirator, orchestrating an elaborate plot to eliminate her husband. It wasn't rage or impulse that had driven her, but cold calculation driven by greed, fantasy, and a desire for freedom at any cost. Emily Carter sat in the small, windowless interrogation room, her hands trembling as officers slid a thick file across the table. The room was silent except for the rustle of papers and the occasional click of a recording device. One by one, the detectives laid out the evidence bank statements. Phone logs, surveillance footage, the burner phone recovered from Ricky Salas, and finally, a series of printed messages that left no doubt about her intentions. With each new piece presented, the confident mask Emily had worn for so long began to crack. At first, she tried to deny everything. She claimed identity theft, said someone must have framed her, suggested that Ricky was trying to extort her. But as the walls closed in, her defiance faded, her voice softened, and the tears came first as a trickle, then as sobs. Surrounded by undeniable proof, Emily finally confessed. Her statement was lengthy, but her justification was familiar. She felt trapped, unloved, overlooked. She claimed she never wanted Daniel dead, only gone, out of the way, so she could start a new life with someone who understood her. The confession sent shockwaves through the community. The courtroom was packed on the first day of her trial. Neighbors who had once bought flowers from her shop now came to watch the proceedings in disbelief. Daniel sat quietly in the front row, his face blank, showing no emotion as prosecutors played clips from Emily's interrogation. The footage of her sobbing confession became the centerpiece of the case and later, the headline of every news story. Wife cries while confessing to husband's brutal murder-for-hire plot. The video went viral, not for its drama, but for its chilling rawness. Viewers around the world were captivated by the story of a woman who lived a double life, planning her husband's death while pretending to love him. Emily's legal team tried to build a defense based on emotional instability and mental trauma, arguing that she had lost herself after years of quiet suffering. They portrayed her as a woman who had been pushed beyond her limits, desperate for escape. But the evidence spoke louder. Detailed planning, the financial transactions, the communications with Ricky, these were not the actions of a distressed, confused person.
It's fine.
They were the hallmarks of someone who had made a deliberate, calculated choice. The jury deliberated for less than a day. Emily was found guilty of attempted murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and solicitation of a violent crime. She was sentenced to 30 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Ricky Salas, who cooperated with investigators, received 12 years for his role in the conspiracy. In the months that followed, Daniel sold the house and closed his clinic. He left the town that once admired his marriage and started over in another state. Emily's flower shop was boarded up, its windows dusty and abandoned. The story of Emily Carter became more than just a local scandal. It became a cautionary tale about the masks people wear and how darkness can hide in even the most picturesque lives.